actually go live. So yeah, welcome everyone to today's video. Let me just make sure we're actually live before I continue. I don't see it yet on my screen, but it should be soon. There we go. Yes. Okay, we're good. Yeah, welcome over to today's video, where I'm very pleased to be joined by Professor Graham Oppy. I'm probably anyone who's watching this review or has seen the debate this review is about is familiar with Professor Oppy, but yeah, it's a professor at Monash University who focuses on philosophy of religion related topics, but it's not really as much about that. We're going to be reviewing a recent debate. I guess it took place about a month ago. Actually, exactly a month ago, right? I think it was May 4th, between Alex Malpass and William Lane Craig concerning, well, the Kalam cosmological argument and whether something can begin from nothing in some sense. And also the second stage of that argument as well. And I thought we're going to review that debate today, at least certain key points from that debate. And yeah, that's going to be it. We'll probably go for about an hour and a half, maybe a bit longer if we need to. But before we start just playing some of the clips from the debate to review, just any opening remarks, Graham? Thanks so much for being here, by the way.
So thanks for inviting me. So I've watched the debate and it's quite interesting. I'm sure we'll have lots of stuff to talk about.
And this one also shares system audio. Okay. How
in
about
the
now?
original book, the Kalam cosmological argument, I more or less
Okay, can I just get confirmation from someone?
made no attempt to defend premise one, that everything that begins to exist has a...
Okay, perfect. Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what happened there, but I guess I just had to restart the share. All right, so I'll just go to the start of the clip that I wanted, which was here.
Of the arguments, or the way that it appeals to our intuitions. I think premise one probably feels the most intuitive. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. But is it just an argument from intuition, or is there a more rigorous way of grounding those intuitions? What's your case for premise one?
In the original book, the Kalam cosmological argument, I more or less made no attempt to defend premise one, that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Because it seemed to me that it was so obvious that any attempt to provide an argument for it would be based on premises less obvious than the statement itself. So it just seemed to me that one just puts that premise out there, that everything that begins to exist has a cause. And if the skeptic wants to deny that premise, then I say he's welcome to do it. He thereby shows himself to be someone who's just interested in an intellectual refutation of an academic argument and not really interested in finding out the truth about reality. Now, since
so maybe we can comment on that clip first. What do you think about him? First of all, just asserting that it's so obvious at the outset, and that anyone who wants to deny it is just, well, I don't know, as an intellectual refutation, not really interested in the truth. Both those remarks seem kind of strange to me. But what do you think?
So the premise that we're talking about says that everything that begins to exist has a cause of its beginning to exist. So we're supposing that there's some order to things. I'm going to think of it as a line. And there are two possibilities. Either for each thing there's an earlier thing, or there's a point where the order begins, right? So there are two cases. If we have infinite regress and there are things that have always existed, then clearly they don't begin to exist. But anything else, that there's a period where it doesn't exist and then it begins to exist. And in that case, if you think there's nothing that's always existed, then you'll be quite happy not only with the claim that everything that begins to exist has a cause of its beginning to exist, but that everything began to exist, right? So that's on the infinite regress case. On the other case, we're supposing that there's a beginning. So what's the status of the first thing? Does it begin to exist or not? If it begins to exist, then this premise is just false, right? Because the first thing can't have a cause, right? We're thinking about a causal order, right? So I want some clarification. Remember that the second premise in the argument is going to be that there's something that began to exist. But if you think that the first, I'll call it the first point of that thing, is just an origin before which there is nothing, then it looks as though if you want to defend this premise, you've got to accept that, you've got to accept that it doesn't have a cause, right? That's the important point, right? So it's not obvious that premise 1 is true.
Yeah, of course, Craig wants to say that, well, he has this special notion of beginning to exist, which seems to kind of navigate this. There's like 4 conditions, right? It's something like something begins to exist at a time t if it exists at t. There's no time prior to t at which it exists. X is existing at t is a tensed fact, and there's no state of X's existence at which it exists timelessly. I think there's something like that, and it's that last one which is meant to preclude God from counting as something that begins to exist.
So I'm thinking, though, that there's no mention of time in the premise. We're just thinking of there being a causal order, right? And it doesn't matter whether time goes back so far and then there's an earlier bit of the causal order, still part of natural reality, but it's not temporal, right? So and he himself considers this as a possibility. So it can't be that begins to exist is going to be unpacked in terms of time, given that he's prepared to countenance that even in the natural reality, there might be a kind of non-temporal bit. So I don't think that way of clarifying things is going to help. Right?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think that's sort of how he puts it, though, right? I mean,
that is how he puts it. But if the question is, what's your response to this premise, then I want to respond the way I just did. And it's certainly not obvious that it's true.
Yeah, we'll get to this a bit. We'll get to some of this a bit later with the sort of inductive generalizations or support he offers for this premise. But I mean, I don't know. I might be a little bit. Okay, so if we think about as you talk about the sort of global causal order, right? Either that's something that goes back indefinitely in time, or it goes back finitely in time, or then you can maybe talk about, could it, in some sense, come apart from time in some way? But I don't know, if we're assuming that it doesn't go back indefinitely, then there's going to be some temporally first cause at least, and then it's just a kind of question whether that temporally first cause is something that begins to exist, or whether it's caused, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. It doesn't seem to me as obvious as it seems to be to him that if it's something that begins to exist, it has a cause. But of course, he goes on to present some arguments for that. But a lot of this seems to come back to me to this intuition, this core intuition that he seems to have for this and related cases. That it just has to be the case. It's so obviously the case that that's the right account. Yeah.
Right. So I assume that we're going to go on and discuss, because he thinks that there's a more fundamental intuition that underlies it. I assume that maybe that's the next thing we're going to talk about. So.
Yeah. So actually, the next thing I wanted to cover was Alex's point about Pickwickish beginnings. So I'll just skip to that. That was at it's a little bit after this, but oh wait, sorry, I forgot to put this back on the stream. There we go.
Brings it into being.
Well, Alex, you're welcome to have a stab at the first premise if you want to. Is this a controversial premise for you?
Well, it's. I think my view is more that I have a much more settled view on the second premise, in the sense that I feel more confident in my undercutting replies there. With the first premise, I'm very interested in exploring the detail and but I'm not going to straightforwardly say I'm committed strongly to it being straightforwardly false. But there are things that I think are worth thinking through. So if I can go into one of these avenues. So there's a philosopher that you and I both share a common interest in, is Arthur Pryor, right? Who's a wonderful philosophical logician working in the 50s and 60s. And he has this paper, Limited Indeterminism, where he engages with an argument from the Calvinist Jonathan Edwards from 1750, something around that time. And Edwards puts an argument that's very similar to one that you do in defense of this premise, which was about, well, if something could begin to exist uncaused, then anything could begin to exist uncaused. And this is where we get this famous, root beer and Beethoven and bicycles could just pop into existence. So Pryor is engaging with Jonathan Edwards' version of that argument. And so pulling at this little thread here, he complains that Edwards says things like the beginning to exist of a headache, for instance.
Yes.
And Pryor complains and says, this is kind of a Pickwickish sense of beginning to exist, because really a headache isn't something that begins to exist. Rather, what we should do is, there's a head that begins to ache, right? It's not that there's a headache that begins to exist. So sometimes we talk about things beginning to exist, but it's a misleading turn of phrase. And actually, the idea underneath that is that there are something like substances which can undergo changes. And that's the right way to paraphrase away some of the apparent beginnings to exist that we might come across. So for instance,
okay, could probably cut it there. So what do you think about this reply from Alex?
So I'm not sure how far it's going to go. Right. So even if you accept that we really somehow or other, if we were speaking strictly, we wouldn't say there's a headache that begins to exist. We'd say there's a head that began to ache. And it's not obvious to me that that you even want to join Alex at that point, but suppose you do. It's a long way from there to thinking that there's no, it turns out that there aren't really any beginnings to exist. There's just rearrangements of stuff that's already there or something like that. And I don't think that the prior point about headaches won't take you that far. And so I'm curious to know what you think. All right.
Yeah. So I agree. And this will come back a little bit. Maybe that's the next clip when Craig points out that, well, wait, are you committed to some sort of meteorological nihilism here? That really what begins to exist, if anything begins to exist, are like physical simples or something like that, if there are any, or fields or whatever we think are the building blocks out of which everything's built, if there are any. There, Alex seems to, be unsure about that, but maybe willing to commit to something like that. I think that's the wrong way to go. Yeah. I think it's definitely, I'm not a nihilist in that way. I do think that I began to exist and so on. Now, that said, I'm willing to grant that I think there's something here in the sense that there does seem to be a worry about how strong the inductive generalization should be when we're extending from cases like this to of things beginning to exist to things like the universe as a whole, or we might talk about global temporal reality, even if it's something apart from the universe, because it seems like they're very different sorts of things. So there, I want to push back. I would want to use this sort of reply not to push back on the inductive base, right, to suggest that these things don't really begin to exist, but to push back on how much weight we put into this inductive generalization given that base. Does that sound right to you? Or
yeah, that sounds pretty good to me. Yeah, I think I'm happy to share that worry. Yeah.
Right. So I'm willing to grant that headaches really do begin to exist, or at the very least, heads begin to exist. If we don't want to say that headache is a thing that might exist. Okay. So the next one I had was and then we had Craig's reply at 11 minutes. Second, I'll get faster at this as we go. Okay.
Disagree with a lot of the underlying philosophy, but just let me ask you, Alex, if, as you say, the universe is distinct in the sense that it begins to exist in a more absolute sense than do Beethoven and root beer and bicycles, wouldn't that simply strengthen the case for a cause of the universe? Because then the argument could be phrased, if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause, even on your own principles.
Well, but what I mean is that if we wonder why think that the universe, the beginning of the universe requires a cause, what we can't do is say, well, look at Beethoven and bicycles and root beer, they all have causes, because that's irrelevant, because they're Pickwickish beginnings. What we're talking about is a metaphysical beginning.
Well, now, again, without disagreeing with that point, one could still ask, couldn't one, why did the universe come into being rather than root beer?
Yeah,
or
sure.
Beethoven, or a gasoline station. And that was Pryor's point.
Yes.
Okay. Probably go there. So what do you think? Do you think this makes it stronger, or what do you think?
So I'm not sure that moving from everything that begins to exist has a cause of its beginning to exist to, if the universe began to exist, the universe had a cause of its beginning to exist, actually improves the argument at all. So I'm not sure about that. I think that there's things to say in response to the idea that if you think that, let's suppose that there's an initial singularity and it has no cause, that instead of the initial singularity, there could have been a root beer that had no cause, or there could have been, a rabbit that had no cause, or something like that. That you can just, I think you can happily just deny that, right? And say, well, we'll get on to, I guess, to discussing why you can happily deny that. It doesn't seem obvious to me that you can't view the initial thing, whatever it is, as having a special status that rules out alternatives to it, right? You can think that it's necessary, right? And this will be fine, I think, because theists typically think that there's an initial thing and it's necessary, right? And if you ask about further explanation for that, there's nothing to be said, right? So that's one sort of thought that will come up at this point. We've kind of glossed over something, which is Craig saying the fundamental intuition here is that out of nothing, nothing comes. And
yeah,
is that
well,
we're going to get to that because that comes up next, that kind of nothing is a quantifier. Yeah,
right.
So maybe I should leave you to.
No, it's good. No, it's good. Just one quick remark on the because you've defended, or at least developed as an alternative this view that, well, maybe whatever is initial, say the initial segment of the universe, or the initial state, or initial kind of regress, if there's a regress, is necessary. And maybe that's right. Maybe that's the right theory of things. And why does that leave us in a worse position than what many theists want to say, where God as a causally initial thing is necessary? But the point is that you could, on that sort of view, or maybe other sorts of views, don't have to be exactly that, you could say, well, here's an explanation for why other things don't begin uncaused.
Yeah, that's
it
right.
had to be this, right? This is the necessary origin. And it's not clear why that's a worse theory than theirs, which posits a necessary origin of a different sort, just because theirs is, in some sense, initially timeless or something like that, and yours is not, or initially a sort of being of a certain sort, and yours is some physical state, perhaps. So maybe you do want to say anything more on that quick.
So not really. You summarise what I want to say. I mean, I'm not absolutely committed to the idea that you have to say that it's necessary. There are alternatives here. One is that it just has no explanation. Maybe that's better, maybe that's worse. I mean, I think there's a kind of interesting discussion to be had about what you want to say about the status of initial things, if you think there are initial things. And I'm not wedded to it being necessary, but one of the advantages of saying that it is will be the one that you mentioned, that now we have a story in which we have something that looks like maybe it counts as an explanation of why it couldn't have been root beer or a bicycle or whatever.
Yeah. I want to say two things. One is, well, I want to leave it open that there's some further explanation for why the initial state, if there was an initial state, is the way it is. But I don't want to require that there is one, let alone a causal explanation, because there might be non-causal explanations of that. But if it turns out that that's sort of all there is, but it could have been a different way, okay, that seems to me not a devastating cost. Is that a sort of brute fact that someone's not willing to admit? Right. I'm willing to admit it, I suppose. Yeah.
So you could also have a view against the theists that goes similar and think that it didn't have to be that it was God at the beginning, or this particular God. It could have been some other God, or maybe there's a bunch of other possible, in some sense, epistemic possibilities, something like that. So it's not like things are going to go differently here for the theist and the kind of naturalist view that we're thinking about.
Yeah, and I think you've made this point also, where it's like there's either going to be some, since God didn't have to create in this way, there's going to either be some chanciness with respect to the existence of God, or some chanciness with respect to what He creates, and plausibly there's going to be some, at one or both of those points, some level of bruteness there. And if we say there's some level of bruteness of what sort of beginning there was, why is that a worse view? I don't see what it would be.
Yeah. So I agree with that. Yeah.
All right, so we can skip to the stuff about nothing.
There was a point there where you, and I'm fully in agreement with you, we hold hands in this part of it, where you complain that there are some physicists like Lawrence Krauss,
yes,
who makes this kind of grammatical confusion about treating. So here's the idea, is that there's this term nothing, and sometimes it's treated as if it's a simple referring term.
Right.
Like, for instance, if I open the fridge and I say, hey, there's nothing in the fridge, right? What I'm not doing is using the term nothing as if it's a term that picks out something that's in the fridge, a kind of empty, void thing that's in the fridge. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying all the things that there are outside the fridge, right? That's what it means. So the term nothing on the surface level, grammatically, it looks like a referring term, right? But like Russell shows us on denoting with definite descriptions, the surface grammar of this term looks like it's a referring term, but it has a deeper logical form, right? So it's some combination of quantifiers, and it's an expression that works differently logically, right? So something
and the reference here, for our listeners' sake, is to Bertrand Russell's paper on denoting.
Yes, that's right. On denoting, kind of inaugural paper of analytic philosophy at the beginning of the 20th century. So the idea is supposed to be that when somebody says there's nothing in the fridge, or I saw nothing on the TV last night, something like that, what they mean is something like everything is outside the fridge, right? For all the things that there are, they're not in the fridge. So we have an existential quantifier and a universal quantifier, and we move the negation across to the other side of the predicate, whatever. It doesn't matter the exact details for this kind of show, but the point is that it operates differently, grammatically speaking. And as you point out in the book, this can be the kind of basis of a joke, like I saw nothing on the TV last night, or was it any good? Kind of thing, right? Then the joke works because it's like exploiting a different grammatical and deeper logical structure. I mean, it doesn't make it funny when you explain the joke, but we all get it intuitively. Now, anyway, bringing it back to what we're talking about, I agree with you there. So if somebody says, like Krauss says something like nothing can give rise to a universe or something. Now, in that sentence, he's treating nothing as if it's a referring term.
Yes.
Pick something out, and that does something, right? As if it has some causal power or properties of some description. I agree with you that grammatically can feel logically confused to talk like that. What we should do instead is to treat it as I was doing, where you paraphrase it into that for all things that there are, it's not whatever the property was. Everything's outside the fridge kind of thing. But then it seems to me that flip a few pages along in the book, you then, I think, make the mistake again. You talk like Krauss does, because you say, well, how could nothingness discriminate between making universes and making Beethoven?
Now, that's why I said a moment ago, Alex, speaking facetiously, it was supposed to be tongue-in-cheek. It's funny. How could nothingness be so discriminatory? There isn't any such thing as nothingness. It means not anything.
Yeah, right.
And so, for the sake of our listeners again, there's a whole range of these universal quantifiers of negation in English, like never means not ever. Nobody means not anybody. Nowhere means not anywhere. None means not one. And nothing means not anything. And so when we talk about the universe as coming into being out of nothing, we mean that it came into being, but it did not come into being out of anything.
Right, but if at any point in the argument you end up having to say something like, well, nothingness has no causal power, so how could it cause something? But if we apply the paraphrase correctly, that means something like everything has some causal power. And now that doesn't do the job of motivating how something could come out of nothing, right?
Well, I think it does. Again, as long as we understand this as a façon de parler, that we're saying that if the universe came into being but did not do so out of anything, then that means that there were no causal powers that brought it into existence. And that is surely impossible, given, as you say, that it is a substance and not merely an event. If a substance comes into existence but not out of anything, that seems to me to give good grounds for thinking there's a cause. So don't pray.
Yeah, maybe we could stop it there. Yeah, so all the stuff they say about the function of the term nothing seems to be fine to me. Although I've heard that probably Krauss isn't as guilty of this as sometimes suggested, but that's not really here nor there. Well, I guess, do you have any initial reactions to this part?
So I guess one of the questions here is going to be about whether the theist thinks that God begins to exist in the relevant sense. Certainly, they think that no causal powers brought God into existence. So they're thinking of God as a kind of initial thing. But then if the naturalist is thinking that no causal powers brought the universe into existence, why are they any worse off? That would be... So this is just accepting what's being said about treating nothing as a quantifier and then sort of seeing what follows.
Yeah, to be honest, I'm not really sure what Craig's point here is supposed to be, except to just reiterate his core intuition. That basically just is the causal principle or something near enough. Like, because when I think Alex rightly pointed out, like, oh, if you're talking about nothingness, not being discriminatory in this way, that's, at best that must be some sort of turn of phrase, but it can't. Like, what is that meant to express? If it's something, is it something more than just the causal principle again? Then what is it? If it's not, then okay, you're just reasserting the thing that is meant to be an argument for. And if we don't share the intuition of that causal principle, and then I'm not sure what ground has been gained. And the other thing I want to mention quickly is that before I mentioned Craig's notion of something quote unquote beginning to exist, it seems a sort of weird and almost gerrymandered notion of beginning to exist. I think to some degree it is, so that it's going to capture things like the universe, but not God. But anyway, he needs it to be, I think, that the intuitions regarding the causal principle are strong on that notion of beginning to exist, but like less strong on a notion that would include something like God. And I don't see why that would be the case. Like, if you exclude from the condition for beginning to exist the exist at a timeless state clause, right, then God would begin to exist. Would he say that the intuition for the causal principle on that notion of begin to exist is just as strong? I guess he would have to say no, but like, why? Like, it just seems like not a significant difference. You see what I'm saying there?
Yeah.
But I think there was a few more seconds maybe on this portion, because I think Craig says something that I wanted to
That's my language too woodenly here. I think it's clear from my earlier disclaimers what I meant.
I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, honestly.
Okay.
Sometimes the dialectic seems to me that if you say, well, the universe must have had a cause, it couldn't have begun to exist without a cause, because substances can't begin without a cause. And if I say, well, why couldn't a substance begin without a cause? And now, if there's in any sense a recourse to saying, well, nothingness has no causal powers, nothingness has no properties, anything like that, strictly speaking, off the table, because if it's just a turn of phrase that's misleading, really. You can't say that. All you can say is, I mean, if we translate that, all it means is everything has some causal power. That's like saying everything is outside the fridge, right? So, but that doesn't help. That doesn't explain why the universe, or it doesn't explain why a substance has to have a cause for its beginning. If I'm genuinely wondering why,
if
it doesn't help me to
there's
say that.
not anything prior to the beginning of the universe, then it follows that there are not any causal powers.
Yes, it does. But what if I was wondering why a substance couldn't begin without a cause? Then it would be no help to say, well, because there was nothing that caused it. Because that's just presupposing that there has to be. So it's not an explanation. It's not helping the dialectic.
As I say, I think there is a metaphysical intuition that out of nothing, nothing comes. And by that I mean that if there's not anything, then not anything can come into being.
Yeah.
From not anything. Being only comes from being, as Parmenides saw. When I began my study of philosophy, this was one of the first.
Yeah. Maybe the thing that I'm thinking about is a bit later. But if the out of nothing, nothing comes, or ex nihilo nihil fit, if that just means something like something cannot come into existence without a cause, or something like that, then that's just to repeat the principle, and I don't think it would be made any further ground. If it's saying something stronger, like, well, it's treating nothing as some sort of prior state or something from which it came in an actual, as a sort of causal relation, then that would fall to the problem that, Craig recognizes it would be a poor description. But either way, it doesn't seem like we've made any further progress. He's just going to repeat that it's his intuition. Is that your reading of that as well?
So I think that's right. So he insists on something like out of nothing, nothing comes, and doesn't give the clarification, doesn't re-express it in the way that he recognizes that he should. If he re-expresses it in the way that he should, then it's not going to seem so. I think it'll lose the illusion of being intuitive for him, or it should, right? Or at least he'll recognize that it's controversial or something like that. So if we're thinking that something like you can't have things that come into existence unless there are causal powers that bring them into existence, if something like that's the principle. And so no substances unless they're brought into existence by something else with causal power, that's going to be deeply problematic.
Right.
Unless we're happy with infinite regress, right? That's the...
Yeah, or he's going to have to.
That's the only way that we can end up being comfortable with that. But that's the thing that we're going to rule out in the sub-argument in the other half.
Right, but that's so Craig's probably going to reply, but I'm going to restrict the principle in this way so it doesn't necessarily cover things that don't begin in this sense, and we're just back to this thing from before.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, and then I had the next segment I had on. Yeah, this was the nihilism point. Maybe we'll play that.
One thing, and just for the record,
Yeah.
I disagree, Alex, that if a substance has material causes or stuff of which it's made, then it's not a bona fide substance that actually comes into being. That's an expression of mereological nihilism, which is a radical position that would require us to say that you don't even exist because you have your parents' sperm and egg that united to form you. And you began to exist when they did unite. There was no Alex Malpass prior to that point, even though there was a sperm and an egg. And that's absurd to say that Alex Malpass pre-existed his birth. Where was he? Where were you? In 1775, what were you doing during the era of galaxy formation? So just for the record, I don't accept this mereological nihilism. I think that there are substances that are composed of stuff, and they do have genuine beginnings, even though they don't come into being ex nihilo.
I think that idea sounds very radical to us in the
Yeah, I probably don't need to play more of that. I mean, we sort of covered this already a bit. I think, to be honest, I think that was probably Craig's strongest point in the debate, mostly because I just agree with what he said there. But yeah, I don't know if we want to discuss that again.
So I think that mereological nihilism is a very strong position. And it has commitments because it commits you to there being simples, and it's not obvious that there are simples, I think. It's certainly, so leave aside the other intuitions that you might have that, for example, that Alex is a substance, right?
Right. Okay, I don't know if there's much point. We can skip to the next part. Yeah, we can do Hilbert's Hotel. I think we can go to that, or the section on that. Start with that.
Which premises do you want to start with first? Which one of those arguments?
Well, I think we've got two philosophical arguments, and I don't think we're going to talk about the causal finitism stuff today. But just to note that when we last spoke, towards the end of that interaction, you brought up the causal infinitism, the Grim Reaper paradox stuff, and I had to say, well, I don't know, I haven't thought about that too much. But since then, I've published, I think, three papers on that, so I have a very settled view there as well now. But
how many papers are going to come out of this discussion? Could be many more.
Yeah, so I've done my homework on that one. But let's talk about, I guess, let's go through them one by one, I guess. So we could talk about what I call the Hilbert's Hotel argument first, if you like, and then move on to successive addition, which is my favorite one, I suppose. So do you want to lay out the...
Well, the idea is that if you could have an actually infinite number of things, it would result in all sorts of situations that I think are metaphysically impossible. Granted, there is no strict logical contradiction. Infinite set theory is a well-developed and, for all appearances, consistent branch of mathematics. But the claim is that this is metaphysically impossible. And one great illustration of this is Bernardette's book. Jose Bernardet imagines a book sitting on the table, and he says, suppose this book has an infinite number of pages, and you open the front cover, and the first page is a half an inch thick. Very, very odd book. The next page is a quarter of an inch thick. The next page is an eighth of an inch thick, and so on ad infinitum. Now he says, turn the book over so that the back cover is facing you. Now, slowly lift the back cover. And he says, what do you see? There's nothing there to see, for there is no last page. And he said if you tried to touch it, either there would be an impenetrable, invisible barrier that would prevent your finger from touching it, or your finger would immediately penetrate through an infinite number of pages into the book. So Benedett says there's no strict logical contradiction involved in such a book, but you only have to consider these kinds of situations in concreto, as he puts it, in concrete terms, to see the outrageous metaphysical absurdity of such a thing.
Yeah, so maybe we could talk about the book, or Benedett's book. I've always said Benedetti, but maybe Craig is right and it's Benedett. Probably is right. What do you think about that case?
Yeah, so I also say Benedetti. One of my teachers wrote a really nice paper called Slicing It Thin. So my teacher was Alan Hazen. And he was thinking about things like, and in fact, he might actually have been discussing the Benedetti book example. And he thought, if we're imagining a world where there could be a book like that, we should also imagine that there are photons that of progressively different, let's say, sizes, and that people will have eyes with receptors of progressively different sizes, so that what happens is when you open up the book, you get a kind of reflection of photons of an appropriate wavelength from each of the pages, right? And then there's some processing in your brain, and that's stuff happening in your brain. That's the seeing of the book. What's it like? Well, we don't even know what it's like to be a bat. Why should we expect to be able to describe what it's like to be able to look at Benedetti's book in the kinds of circumstances where it would actually be possible to do that? Right. So that's one kind of response that you might make. Part of what's going on there is that you might think that worlds where you're going to have infinite hotels and Benedetti's book and things like that have got to be really different from our world. They probably have to have this kind of infinite structure everywhere. Like you can't have a world that's partly like ours, where we have finite cutoffs of various kinds, and then you have these other things with the where you don't have a cutoff and you've got this kind of infinite levels of detail. Right, so that's one thing that occurs to me to say in response to this example. Related to that, and is something of a kind of more familiar point, that when we imagine that there could be an infinite past, we're not necessarily committing ourselves at all to the possibility of Benedetti's book, right? Having a series of days, one after another, doesn't give you the kind of structure that space-time would have to have in order for it to be possible to have Benedetti's book. And also, I want to say, though this is more controversial, that allowing that there's an infinite past doesn't give you, doesn't guarantee that Hilbert's Hotel is possible either. Right? So that given that what we're supposed to be denying is either a kind of infinite causal sequence stretching back into the past, or an infinite amount of time stretching back into the past, none of these examples, it seems to me, are even relevant to the question whether that's possible or not.
Right, good. So you have two things there. The latter thing being, it looks like you'll need some further reason to think that these the possibility of these things sort of stand or fall together, and that would require a little bit more argument. Maybe it could be given, but it doesn't. You don't get it for free. Yeah. But the first thing, like about the book in particular, those remarks seem fair to me. I mean, more generally, we might think that, like when we imagine turning over this book, that it has no last page, right? The pages keep getting thinner, but there's sort of no last page there. We ask, what would we see? Or if we pressed our finger down, what would happen? Well, it might be that a book with those features is sort of not well behaved given facts about our actual physics, in particular facts about actual optics and so on. But does that entail the book's impossible, or just that it's not well behaved for physical laws of those sorts, right? I'm going to say it's probably more the latter. And you could fill in the details. You described a way where you could fill in the details where there's a coherent description of what would occur. You could fill in another one. Suppose that for this sort of like limit surface, which you would have if you turn the book over, it doesn't reflect light. It just absorbs light. Then you would just look black, right? Why would we think? And if you pressed into the limit surface, you could tell a similar story. You can tell other stories about how it might behave or evolve or interact with other things. Yeah. Why would that seems to me like the more plausible way to go than just saying, well, it's an impossible object. Maybe it's not possible. Not compossible with certain physical facts or physical laws, but that only goes so far. Does that seem like in line with you? What do you say?
Right. So I'm kind of sympathetic, more sympathetic to the idea that actually there's a lot fewer possibilities than you will think there are if you think that conceivability is a good guide to possibility. I mean, to metaphysical possibility. So sure, conceivability tells you about something, like what you can imagine, what you can pretend, what you can conceive in some sense. But Craig himself, in the early book, talked about what's really possible, or kind of what's ontologically possible, or something like that. And there's a dispute to be had, a serious one, I think, about whether conceivability or what you can imagine and so on is a guide to that, whatever it is. And you might think. And so, for example, I've had conversations with John Pyle, and he thinks something similar, that maybe you shouldn't postulate more possibilities than you need, right, for the purposes of ontology and metaphysics. And then you will have a kind of principled reason that rests in your theory of modality for saying these things really are impossible. This is all highly controversial, and there's clearly no obligation to go the way that I'm inclined to go on this, but there is a route to take where you just say, no, there couldn't be a Hilbert's Hotel, there couldn't be a Benedetti book, there couldn't be infinitely many Grim Reapers and so on. Not really. That's not a real possibility. It's only something that you can imagine.
Yeah. So, well, I don't want to sidetrack onto modality too much, but. Yeah, but I definitely take a different view, and I would have certain methodological concerns for the way that Craig approaches this, in particular, relying on these intuitions to figure out what's really possible. I think maybe in some cases that's fine, but I think it seems to be. Well, I'm not going to get into it now, but I think I would not approach it in that way, broadly speaking.
So not in the way that Craig does, by way of appealing just to intuitions. You want to start off by saying, what's your theory of reality? I think that's
right, exactly. Right. So I want to think,
and then we can have an argument about that.
Right. Exactly. So I want to think about, well, first of all, I don't think there's sort of a kind of privileged modality. I think we can have different modalities. But you can talk about a metaphysical modality and think, well, sort of what are the constraints, or what are we sort of getting at when we talk about this sort of space? And then you could do that, and if we could answer that somewhat, then maybe we can get a bit better of a purchase on what things are possible or impossible in the relevant sense, and to what degree we think these sorts of intuitions would be illuminating about those possibilities. Without doing that, it just seems to me like not a well thought out discipline or enterprise.
Right. So going back to the example that I borrowed from Alan Hazen, you might think that so long as you can describe in kind of rough terms how variation of the laws and some other features of the actual world would hang together, that's enough for a kind of possibility, right? So,
it might not be possible in a certain sense, like and if you think that there's some sort of true ontological or like the correct modality in some sense, then I mean it's a question of whether it's possible in that sense. But anyway, we don't need to explore that more here because it's not super important. I think there was more to this segment that I wanted to cover. So let's see here.
Another example is Hilbert's Hotel.
Right. This would be the brainchild of the brilliant German mathematician David Hilbert, where he imagines a hotel with an actually infinite number of rooms that is completely
of new guests, even an infinite number of new guests. Kind of strange, not what normal hotels are like. But it's not quite clear to me that that's enough to say that it couldn't exist. It's Alexander Proust has this, I guess although he's a defender of versions of the Kalam, also has this kind of fun quip about this, complaining about this, saying that the strange and the impossible are not the same as witnessed by the platypus, which is obviously strange but not impossible, right? But the point is supposed to be something like, I could agree that it's strange, and I mean, maybe I'll agree to use the word absurd, but it's not quite clear to me that absurd means impossible. Maybe there is something that's absurd. There's absurdist theatre. I find all sorts of things absurd, like traffic and people that I bump into on the street. That doesn't mean that they're impossible. I'm using the word differently to you, but I'm not sure how it's a litmus test for impossibility to say that it's absurd. If there was an infinite hotel, that's what it would be like. You'd be able to shuffle guests around. I mean, what's the problem?
Yeah, now that's not in dispute, that if there were an infinite hotel, this is what it would be like. Right, we agree on that. But that's not enough to show that this hotel is something that's metaphysically impossible. And I think the point has to come at which the agglomeration of these sorts of crazy situations just becomes intolerable or backbreaking. Now, for me, it comes very quickly, as I explained right at the beginning of the podcast today. If I imagine an infinite library of books with an infinite number of books on the shelves, and the books are only two colors, red and black, and they alternate, red and black, red and black, red and black, red and black. I can see how someone could say, well, there are just as many red books as there are black books. They're both infinite. But how could it be the case that there are as many red books as there are all of the red books plus all of the black books? That just seems crazy to me. And yet, as you say, that's how it would be if there were an infinite library. And so you have these situations like this that, for me, just become intolerable. And I just hope that my reader or listener will find himself coming to that point as well.
Yeah, but then it just sounds like an appeal to intuition, right?
Yes, it is.
But then what if your reader doesn't share the intuition?
Well, then he needs to reform his intuition.
Well, why should they? Why don't you reform your intuition?
Okay, I thought maybe stopping there because I thought there was a interesting remark from Craig that if you don't have those intuitions, then maybe you should reform them. Yeah, what do you think about that?
So, well, about the you should reform your intuitions point, that clearly doesn't cut any weight at all in a philosophical dispute where intuitions, both of philosophers and ordinary people, are all over the map. So, right. I mean, Alex's reply was perfectly fine. Why don't you reform yours?
Yeah.
I guess we're going to get on to this, but what Craig said there was crazy. Involved him saying things about there are just as many things of one kind as another. And as Alex goes on to say, this really needs some unpacking because there are two different. So if you think of Al-Ghazali's argument about the number of times that the Earth's rotated the sun and the number of times that Jupiter's rotated the sun, there's a sense in which they've made the same number of rotations in infinite time, right? It's the same cardinality. But there's a sense in which Jupiter's made only 1/9 as many rotations as the Earth has made. And one way to do that is to say, look, think of the limit of the series that records the number of rotations that Jupiter has made relative to the Earth every 100 years. And the limit of that series is just 1/9, right? And so in that sense, they've made a different number of rotations. And these two ways of understanding how many are both perfectly legitimate, right? It's just that they're distinct, right? And you have to remember to keep them separate.
Yeah. Plus, in the case of the books, like the red and black books, there's something to be said. Like, yes, okay, both of the sets of just the red books, or the set of the red books and the black books, are both infinite, and it's a feature of infinite of the same kind that they can be put into one-to-one correspondence. So they're equinumerous in a certain sense. But there are, strictly speaking, books in the second set that are not in the first set, and not vice versa, right? So of course, there's all the black books. So in that sense, there's books missing, right? In a sense, there's fewer books in a way. Not fewer in the sense that it's lower cardinality, because by construction it's the same cardinality, but there's books that are then not there, that are in the other set. And I just don't see why. I think that pointing out that, and also pointing out the sort of limit point that you talk about, the black and red books occur at double the frequency of just the red ones. I don't feel that there's a strong intuition, at least for me, that there's something more problematic about this case. It seems like we can accommodate both our everyday intuitions about the frequency of them, and books missing from the one side but not the other, but also the mathematical facts about infinity and equinumerosity. That's where I would leave that case. But yeah, I don't know if you want to say anything more.
So I agree. There's two ways in which a collection can be bigger. Well, if you've got two collections, there can be a sense in which one's bigger than the other and another sense in which one of them's smaller than the other. And there's no contradiction in that. It's only if you somehow insist on there only being one sense for the word how many, and then you make a decision about which way you're going to go. You're going to forget about Hume's principle and only respect Euclid's maxim, which is the way that Craig wants to go. Once you've made that decision, it looks like you're getting yourself into trouble. But if you don't make that decision, if you accept that there's just different ways of talking here, then you don't get any contradiction.
Yeah, actually, and they talk about that when they talk about subtraction. Maybe I'll play that. Well, I was going to play the inconsistent triad part first, but I don't know if there's. Let me just play that quickly and see if there's something more we can comment on.
I feel like complaining that Hilbert's hotel isn't like a finite hotel, holding on. So basically there are two intuitions that are pulling in opposite directions, right? One of them is that if you can line up the elements of two sets one to one, then that shows you that they have the same, that they're equinumerous. That's Hume's principle. Mm-hmm. The other one is that if you take a proper part out of a whole, that must be smaller than the whole, right? The whole must be greater than the proper part. That's sometimes called Euclid's maxim, right? Yes. But in the infinite case, as Galileo showed, that it just fails, right? There are just as many even numbers as there are natural numbers. So those two concepts kind of overlap in the infinite case. You can have proper parts that are equinumerous to the whole. And that's just, tough. That's what it's like. So you can't just take your intuitions with you and say, well, damn it, this can't exist because of my intuitions. That just feels like very bad practice in metaphysics. And we have to be much more subtle than that. That's too rigid. And like I say, parochial, it seems to me.
I don't think that's fair at all. These arguments against the actual infinite are centuries old, more than a millennium, and include some of the greatest mathematicians like Gauss, for example, who refused to admit anything other than the potential infinite, or David Hilbert. You can't say that David Hilbert needed to reform his metaphysical intuitions in light of his mathematical knowledge. You yourself, Alex.
He goes on to talk about some cases where Alex employs intuitions, but yeah, I don't know if you want to comment on that. I mean, pointing out that the arguments or the intuitions have some history and some pedigree. I don't know if that really says much there, but I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't think that appeals to authority are going to cut much ice here, because the views of Gauss and Hilbert are just minority views amongst mathematicians, have been for forever, really. I mean, even when Hilbert was quite influential, he wasn't influential because of his ideas about infinity, exactly. So it just seems like, as a kind of argumentative strategy, it's not very strong when you know full well that the distribution of opinion is all over the place. All that follows in this case is that really good, really smart mathematicians were wrong about some things.
Yeah. I mean, frankly, I'm not even so surprised that there'd be some intelligent mathematicians or competent mathematicians that would say things like this. I mean, after all, there's these things are kind of strange, right? At the very least, it's like unusual. And so how surprising is it there'd be somebody saying, there just couldn't be anything like that? Well, I mean, maybe not that surprising, but
yeah,
I think we can accommodate that and save many of the things that we've already said. But anyway, if he just wants to say, but I don't share their intuitions, it seems like at best it's a sort of stalemate, and Craig hasn't offered him reason to reject his intuitions in favor of his own. That's how I think about it.
I mean, it is also the case that there's a kind of slow development here. I mean, he could have appointed to I mean, maybe he did at one point mention Galileo's worries about this, and there were earlier people who were worrying about this too. And you might think that Galileo may well have had a different view if he'd had the benefit of studying ZFC or something like that.
Right. Okay. Then I wanted to skip to the next point about the subtraction.
Occupied, and yet you funnel in infinitely more people without doubling up any guests anywhere or adding any more rooms to the hotel. This is really strange. And if I might add, as you know, I think.
Oh, sorry, that wasn't the timestamp that I wanted. It was Oh no, it is just in this section. It's a little bit
Hilbert
further on.
only considered positive
it is.
arithmetic operations on the hotel, addition or multiplication. But in infinite set theory, the inverse operations of subtraction and division are prohibited because they lead to logical contradictions. And so it occurred to me, well, what happens when people start checking out of Hilbert's hotel? If all of the odd numbered guests check out, then an infinite number of people have left the hotel. And so infinity minus infinity is infinity. But if all the guests in rooms 4, 5, 6, and so on leave the hotel, then an infinite number of people have left the hotel, but 3 still remain. So infinity minus infinity is 3. And you can get any number from 0 to infinity as a result of these inverse operations. And yet in each case, exactly the same number of people left the hotel as in the previous examples. And boy, to me, Alex, this may not be a knockdown argument, but I find it persuasive.
Well, I think that this is, in a sense, it's exactly the same thing. There's nothing new in the subtraction as the addition, because we're still messing about with Hume's principle and Euclid's maxim. I think the way that it sounds worse is because you're saying infinity minus infinity is 3, infinity minus infinity is infinity, whatever. And then it looks like you've got 2 lines of arithmetic that give you different non-unique solutions to it, right? And that's why it's not an operator in a standard Cantorian transfinite arithmetic, right? There's no subtraction operation there. And this, I guess this does get kind of technical, but the way to think about it is that, if it's not normal arithmetic, right? Infinity minus infinity equals 3 is not a statement in normal arithmetic, because infinity isn't a value that normal arithmetic can take. And it's not a statement in the standard Cantorian transfinite, because then there's no subtraction.
Because what?
Because subtraction isn't a mathematical operation in that system.
Well, they won't. It's unpermitted because
it doesn't have unique
the
values.
answers are undefined. You get contradictions.
But the point is that what you're doing is giving a kind of pseudo-mathematical formulation. It's not a statement in any formal system that actually, what you're using the word subtraction, but I can't put that in a formal context. There is no formal context in which infinity minus infinity equals 3 is actually, maybe there are various different versions of transfinite arithmetic. I think Conway's got one which does have subtraction. But putting that to one side, it seems to me the easiest way, if you want a formal theory in which to describe those guests leaving Hilbert's hotel, you just need to appeal to the notion of the relative complement in set theory. So we can just say, the relative complement of A and B is just going to be, we could say the relative complement of the even-numbered guests in Hilbert's hotel is the odd-numbered guests, right? So if what you're saying is, the subtraction of the even-numbered guests, I'm just going to write that out as a relative complement, and it'll tell me which guests are left, as in all of the even-numbered ones. Now, the relative complement of all of the guests in rooms numbered 3 and above in Hilbert's hotel is all the guests in rooms 1, 2, and 3. So now I know, I plug that in, I get out the right answer. There's no contradiction. It looks like an inconsistency or something because you're using a kind of pseudo-mathematical statement that doesn't belong anywhere in the kind of roster of mathematical theories. And I just think that's a kind of misleading way of describing it.
The set theoretic formulation that you just gave is actually an attempt to conceal the contradiction, which is an arithmetic contradiction. It's an arithmetic operation that leads to contradictory results precisely because of the difference in removing different subsets out of the original set. So the point that I think remains is that using the normal definitions of subtraction and remainder and so forth, you get contradictory results with this transfinite arithmetic if you try to do these inverse operations. And you're quite right. The mathematician will simply say, well, that's prohibited. You can't do that. But as I say, you can't stop people from checking out of a hotel.
No.
And so,
okay, I wanted to play all that because I thought it was important to get Alex's explanation of relative complement there, which I thought was a good response. So yeah, maybe if you want to give some thoughts on that, what do you think about this?
So I don't know if this is going to work or not, but so there was a time when people counted from 1 upwards, and we didn't have the concept of 0. And then let's suppose mathematicians decided that it was actually kind of useful to have 0 as a number. I can hear Craig objecting, but look, 0 over 0 is undefined, right? You're just concealing a contradiction in your system, right? To which, now I'm not sure whether that's exactly analogous or not, but the point is that mathematicians are going to develop their formal systems to serve the purposes that they want them to serve. And adding 0 is happened so far back in time, right, that people forget about the utility of having 0, so that we have an answer to sort of 5 minus 5, right? Maybe that's not analogous, but it feels to me that Craig's making a move that's a bit like saying, no, you can't add 0 because it turns out that 0 over 0 is undefined, and division means division, right?
Yeah.
Go
Well,
on.
I was going to say, I that seems fine. I mean, I just don't really get it. I mean, so like we can have different. The point is, you can have, if you have 2 infinite sets, one of which is a subset of the other. They can have, sorry, you imagine 3 infinite sets. The latter 2 are both subsets of the first, right? They might form different relative complements with the first one. In fact, they might form different, they have different relative complements with different cardinalities. One of them might be finite, one of them might be infinite, one of them might be 0. Okay, that's a fact about what sets. That's a feature of sets like this, right? That's just, in fact, that's one way to state what an infinite set is of the relevant sort, that it has its equinumerous with a proper subset. That's right. So if we specify only that infinite subset has been removed, that's underspecified what the relative complement is, or the cardinality of the relative complement. If we specify which elements in particular have moved, then that will specify a unique, not just the unique cardinality of the relevant complement, but it will specify what the relative complement is. Okay, right? That's what we'd expect, right? And we're not stopping people from checking out. They'll check out, and which people check out will determine what people remain, and so we can talk about what relative complement there is and the cardinality of that relative complement. I just don't see the problem in supposing that, well, if we're only given that an infinite number have been removed, it's underspecified or it's compatible with multiple answers what the cardinality of those that remain is. That's true, right? Because you could have, that's a feature of what sets like this are like. He seems to require that it be unique in the way that standard arithmetic subtraction, finite subtraction works, that you get a unique answer if you're told how large the values are. Why would we require that? That's just to repeat some sort of intuition against infinite collections and operations.
We can't require it. We have to say that there is no subtraction if we take the natural numbers and enlarge it by just adding the infinity symbol, right? That kind of simple extension, right? Then it's like taking the natural numbers from 1 upwards and adding 0. We now are forced to say that division's undefined in a case where it was defined everywhere previously. We just have to say here we can't define subtraction once we've added the infinity symbol in, and that's fine. It's not a problem.
Yeah. Okay, I did want to jump to the part about successive addition because there was something there that was good.
Simply say that an actually infinite collection of things, if it were created by God, he'd have to create it all at once. It would be ex nihilo, boom, an infinite library come into being. But even God couldn't create it by simply adding 1 book at a time, because I think it's impossible for an actual infinite to be formed by successive addition in that way. And this would be the case whether one begins at a point and tries to reach infinity by successive addition, or one never begins but counts down from infinity to ending at the present. Either one of these seems to be an impossible task. for forming an actually infinite collection of things.
Great. Okay, wonderful. So
I don't know if we need to play Alex's response. He gives considers different cases an indirect or a direct argument here. But I mean, just at the outset, what do you make of this successive addition style argument? You can't form an actual infinite by sort of successively adding members to the set.
Right. You'll have to.
Yes. Okay.
So it depends what we mean by an actual infinite, partly. And it's not, I think that people who discuss this often don't take the time to define what they mean carefully enough. So think about the count up and count down cases, and suppose that we have today is 0, right? And there's one case where someone's counted backwards to here, and there's another one where they count forwards, right? If we think about the forwards case, there's no point in the future where there's more than finitely many numbers counted. And you might think that's what it means for this to be a case where we only have a potential infinity, right? But in the backwards case, if we look backwards, there's no point in time where there's more than finitely many numbers remaining to be counted. And so in the same sense, this is a merely potential infinity too, right? You don't get the achievement of infinity in the count up case, and you don't get the achievement in the count down case either, right? Because there's always only finitely many things that need to be counted, right? And I should stop and not anticipate something that's going to come later, but you may already see how I'm going to answer that, the kind of subsequent thing that Craig says. Now, you might think, though, that there's a kind of asymmetry, right, about the past and the future, because the past has happened and the future is yet to come. But that's a different sense of potential that shouldn't be confused with the sense of potential that attaches precisely to the infinity, right? So that I think the past case is no less a sort of merely potential than the future, if you want to insist on tying the definition of potential to the feature that I just drew attention to.
Right. Good. Yeah. So I'm mentioning a couple of things there. One on the potential versus actual infinite distinction. The way I tend to think about it, and maybe this is not the way other people would put it, is that a potential infinite, it's not a quantity per se. I think of it more as a process or a procedure, right? Where there's at some time or at any point in the procedure, a finite collection, and there's a sequence of steps that never ends where only finitely many are added at each step. And I think of that sort of procedure as sort of a potential infinite. Whereas an actual infinite, well, something is actually infinite if the answer to the question how many is Aleph null, or some other infinite. The answer is infinitely many. And that will, if there's an infinite future, the future never ends. The answer to the question how many days will transpire, the answer is infinitely many.
Yeah, the answer is still Aleph null. And it's the same for the countdown. How many days have transpired? Aleph null. But none of them was a day infinity.
Right. But Craig, although this doesn't come up here, wants to say that there's, well, he had a previous discussion with Alex where some of the stuff come up where they talked about the future perfect versus the different tenses of like will be versus will have been. Craig wanted to focus on the will have been for some reason, but I don't think that's the right way to analyze statements about how many will there be. But he also, I think, wants to say that there's important differences between the past and the future in this case, because in some way, like the past events sort of have transpired, and there's something to that forming an actual infinite, whereas the ones that will transpire do not. But I'm not exactly sure why he thinks that, because if I want to say, if it's endless towards the past and endless towards the future, the number of past events is infinite, the number of future events is infinite, and not merely potentially so. It's that an actual infinite number that have transpired and an actual infinite number that will transpire. And especially if you don't take some sort of like a growing block view where the past is sort of adds on to the your ontological inventory, right? Then that may be introduced an extra asymmetry there. If you're a presentist or something else, where from whence come the asymmetry? I'm sure he'll say something in response, but I don't see it.
You can also have a shrinking block view too.
Right.
Which is worth thinking about in context as well.
True. But yeah, but as for successive addition itself, if successive addition just means that each element in the resultant infinite set was added one at a time, then why can't that form an actual infinite? So if I think that if you label each element added with a natural number, where maybe the last one I add is labeled number 1, the one before that number 2, and so on.
Yeah.
I added 1 today, 2 yesterday, 3 the day before, and so on. then the forming that particular set ended today when I added the number that corresponded, the one that corresponded to number 1. That seems to be forming an actual infinite set by successive addition. I don't see the problem. It's true that at each day prior, I had already formed an actual infinite collection, but not the same actual infinite collection as the one that I had just formed, because it hadn't included that last member or other ones that hadn't been yet added. I just don't see the problem, or what's supposed to be the issue with that, not getting to the other concern he has for successive addition, but just the very notion of forming an infinite set by successive addition. That seems perfectly coherent to me. I think that's what would obtain. I don't know. Do you share the same?
No, I agree. I agree 100% with that.
Yeah. Fair enough. I forget if there was something more in this part, or if we can just skip to the like why now rather than another time point. Let's see, which part was this?
To the end of the beginningless, right? Because the beginningless thing has an end. Like, let's say today, if I'm counting down. So it's not that I can't get to the end, right? Because it does have an end. I can get to the end in a sense. So the problem with the count up is I can't get to the end of the endless, but clearly that doesn't apply to a beginningless thing that has an end. I can get to the end of the beginningless. So there's the symmetry principle there. It doesn't really work. There's a kind of logical gap between the two. So I don't like the indirect arguments where you try and argue you can't count up to infinity, therefore you can't count down from infinity. Like, I'll say, let's just suppose you can't count to infinity.
Yes.
Still, I don't think that you've established that I couldn't have counted down from infinity. So the man who's ending his 3, 2, 1.
No, this wasn't the clip that I wanted. Maybe it is.
I just finished counting down through all of the numbers.
Oh, sorry.
What's wrong with that scenario on its own, right? Without appealing to the impossibility of counting up.
Well, remember, the goal is to try to form an actually infinite collection of things by successive addition.
Yeah.
If you allow that there is a sort of surd initial segment that is actually infinite, then clearly he could come to the end by counting down from that point to the present. But if there was never a beginning, if the entire series was formed throughout by successive addition, it seems very difficult for me to even conceive of how such a task could be completed. Before he could arrive at any number in the infinite past, he would already have to have counted an infinite number of prior numbers. And so he just gets pushed back and back and back and back into the past. And it's hard to see how he could count any number, because before he could reach it, he'd already have to have counted an infinite number of numbers. Now,
yeah. So, I mean, they repeat some of the same stuff, but I'm not imagining that there's some like boom, there's an initial infinite segment, and then he starts counting 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. No, each of the members was counted in that way. I just mentioned, he just mentioned 3, 2, 1 at the end to summarize the last few that were added, but all of them were added in that way. I'm not sure I really understand the concern that Craig is raising here. What do you think?
Yes, I agree. So it's true for every number n that's counted. The day before, there's a number n plus 1 that was counted. And this is just true for all n. So you can't point to a single element in this series that wasn't a successive addition to its immediate predecessor. Right? And it's just true for all n. Right? Now, there's something that's bothering Bill, but it can't be a problem about this thing being formed by successive addition, because it just obviously is.
Yeah, or at least if there's some sort of absurdity in that, or impossibility, it's not clear to me. From what I've seen him explain or write about this, it hasn't been drawn out to me in a way that, oh, I see now that's why it's impossible. It just seems to be, perhaps he's just relying on a basic metaphysical intuition again, or something like that, for why he thinks that this wouldn't work. But if so, then I don't share it, at least presently.
Right. He's right that pick any day, day n, and there's infinitely more numbers in that direction. But the same is true with counting up, right? No matter how many numbers you've counted, there's infinitely more to come, right? And if we imagine someone just counting forever, that doesn't seem that it's now got a feature that's more problematic, less problematic than the counting down, right? It's either we've all, no matter how far back you go, there's infinitely more things that way, or no matter how far you go forwards, there's infinitely more things that way, right? It just seems like a symmetry.
Yeah, I am a fan of these sorts of concerns about there's symmetries in the past and the future. If he wants to say that there's a relevant asymmetry there, presumably has to do with something to do with the direction of time, like why because the arrow of time is pointing to this way, past the future. That explains why these cases are not symmetrical in the way you describe. But if so, then what is it? Like, why does the fact that there's this arrow of time in that direction explain why these cases are not symmetrical in the way you describe? It's not clear to me why that would be. Yeah. Okay, so then the part about the, like, why finish now rather than another time?
I add the additional point that I think is a really good question. If he could count down from infinity, why did he finish only today? Why didn't he finish yesterday or the day before that? By then, he'd had an actually infinite number of prior moments to finish his countdown. So if he could finish by today, he should have finished by any point in the infinite past. But in that case, at no point in the infinite past could we find the man counting down, which is contradictory to the hypothesis that he's been counting down from infinity. So that seems to me to augment the counterintuitive nature of this sort of task of counting down from infinity. And I would notice that this sort of countdown, or descending infinite, as opposed to an ascending infinite, is prohibited in Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory by the axiom of foundation, which requires that sets be well-founded. It prohibits this kind of infinitely descending set, such as we're envisioning here, because it's not constructible. To construct that kind of set, you've got to begin in the present and then count backwards and turn it into an ascending series. But of course, that's not the way events happen in time. They happen forward, not backwards.
Well, so a moment ago, I was complaining that your arithmetical sentence didn't belong in any mathematical system, and you told me, well, it's just a normal version of subtraction. I'm not worried about the lack of formal system for it to belong to. But now you want me to go along with what ZFC says and be, guided by that. It seems like it's a double standard there. But listen, I think you gave two arguments, and on my YouTube channel, I've done a real super deep dive.
So perhaps we can just comment on this part for now. Yeah, I mean, on this notion that if something, that if he's at sufficient time, in the sense that there's been an actual infinite history to complete an infinite count, would explain why he's, sorry. Well, actually, this part is mostly about the, he should have finished it already point.
Yeah.
Right. So what do you think about that?
So he counted 1 today, he counted 2 yesterday, he counted 3 the day before, he counted 4 the day before. We go back, right? And every day we can answer the question, why did he count n on this day? Because he counted n plus 1 the day before. We can say to Bill, he's always been going to finish today. And that explains why he finishes today, right? And that seems like a satisfactory explanation to me. And it's true that we can imagine a different case where someone's counting down and they finish yesterday or they finish tomorrow. But then For the one that finishes tomorrow, it was always true that they were going to finish tomorrow. And for the one that finished yesterday, it was always true that they were going to finish yesterday. And we have a distinction between the cases. So I'm not sure why that's not sufficient, why it's not sufficient to say that.
Yeah, what do you think about the following remark? Consider a finite countdown. Well, it's supposed to count down from 100. But there's been more than enough time, obviously, even if the history is finite, to complete a count of that sort. Then we might ask, well, wait a minute. It's a finite count of only 100. That could have been finished yesterday or the day before or the day before that. Why is it finishing today? Well, then you might say, well, okay, because he started counting on this day, and then he counted the next number on this day, and so on and so on. But basically, all you've added is a mapping between counting events and days in the history. And you provided a mapping which predicts that the final count would occur today. I can do the same thing in the infinite case. I can provide a mapping between two.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. Like what's so special about once you explain which days are counted when, as you point out, it'll always be the case that such a count will end on today because that's a consequence of the sort of mapping in question. That's the same in the infinite case as it is the finite case. Now, there's some sort of additional strangeness in the infinite case in the sense that, it could have finished on any day in history, for example, if it had been the right sort of mapping, whereas that's not the case for finite counts and in a finite history. But so what? I mean, I don't know. I don't see what that would do to the point. But maybe this is just a rephrase to what you said. Yeah.
Like if there's only been 7 days so far, I can't count down to 22 because there haven't been enough days yet for me to do it. Right. That is a feature of the finite case, but it doesn't seem relevant.
Right. Yeah. And this may come up a little bit later. By the way, we've gone for almost an hour and a half. Are you fine to go for another half hour? I do want.
Sure.
Yeah, because there's not really that many things left, but I do want to cover some of the stage 2 stuff that they talk about. But I just want to say, as an aside, not to get into this more particularly, Craig takes a sort of relational view of time. What sort of further explanation beyond explaining how the counting events relate to other events and sort of what days get mapped to what counting events and so on would we expect to have on that view? I'm not sure that there could be something more, either in the finite case or the infinite case. But anyway, that seems to me like a worry that he shouldn't have on his own view.
Yeah, good.
But yeah, that could be explored more. That we'll skip over for now. Yeah, so we could say more, look at this a little bit more, or we could just go to the sort of stage 2 stuff, inferring from because the way the Kalam argument works is this core syllogism is usually put as everything that begins to exist has a cause, or at least if the universe begins to exist, it has a cause, and premise 2 of the universe began to exist, so it had a cause. And then you'll often say, well, the way the argument's presented, that's the core syllogism, and then there's like further inferences you might make to what sort of cause that is, right? So Craig wants to say that it's a powerful, atemporal, spaceless, personal agent with libertarian freedom, and so that's what they talk about towards the end of their discussion, and I'll put part of that in here.
I add the additional point that I think is a really good question. If it could count down from infinity, why?
Sorry, it didn't skip to the point that I wanted. I wanted 1:16:41.
Best explanation of its action is that it must be a personal agent rather than some kind of impersonal force or mechanism or something that's there,
Yes.
right? So I'm not misrepresenting
Not
the
at all.
view at all. Okay. So it seems to me that a lot of those things are quite. I was trying to think of like a pithy way of saying. So I don't mean this at all in a disrespectful way, but I mean it seems to me that to summarize it clearly, it's like an argument from lack of imagination, right? It's just that like, I can think of other explanations, other ways that you could possibly just dispute any of those points, right? So for instance, does it need to be supremely powerful to create the universe? I think I can imagine situations where something of not very much power kicks off something that goes on to be quite powerful. So this is a bit of an abstract way of thinking about it, but the Neoplatonists think about some kind of the one which emanates a demiurge that has something like a bit more causal power and a bit more freedom, which itself emanates a secondary demiurge that can do a bit more. That's a bit of an old-fashioned way of thinking. A more up-to-date version of this might be the kind of AI, Nick Bostrom AI superintelligence scenario, where you get some AI that can create, it's not very clever, but it can create a version of itself that's a bit more clever than it, and that can create a version of AI that's a bit more clever than it, and we get this kind of hierarchy until you get to a point of something that's super intelligent. And you might think, well, here's something super intelligent. It must have been created by something that was very, very intelligent or powerful. But no, it could be incrementally created by something that's not very clever or powerful, like a kind of avalanche that's kicked off by something small can result in a big effect. So I just think you can't look at the universe and say, oh, it's very big, and it must have been something very powerful to make something so big. It may have been something that didn't have much power.
Well,
right?
It's important to see that I don't claim that you can show that the creator of the universe is omnipotent or supremely powerful. The word I use is enormously powerful. And the reason for that is because it brings the universe into being out of nothing. And here, I'm tempted by John Donne's SCOTUS argument that there is an infinite distance between being and non-being. And so any being that has the capacity to create things ex nihilo, regardless of their size, has to be omnipotent. Well, I'm not committing myself to that, but it does seem to me he has to be enormously powerful. Remember?
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, some interesting points there regarding whether the cause would have to be powerful, or how powerful it would have to be. I'll just throw out a couple of concerns that I might have there. One is that, are we assuming that it has to create ex nihilo? So why would the Kalam argument not work with sort of panentheism or some other view on which the cause, whether it's divine or not, creates out of pre-existing stuff? That seems to be an option. Maybe he has a further argument against that, but that should be another option. And secondly, I'm not so convinced that creating something out of nothing in this way, with no material cause, would require immense power. I mean, I don't know. If it turned out that physicists became convinced of a theory on which there are these things that could fluctuate into existence without any material cause, okay, and then maybe there's something that could make that happen. I'd be like, okay, I mean, maybe that's a bit strange, but I wouldn't necessarily think it's incoherent or that the cause would have to be immensely powerful. And so I guess I would lean on Alex's side here in thinking that it's still not clear to me that even if it has to create ex nihilo, that the cause would have to be enormously powerful. And what if it turns out that the only thing it could do, it could create one initial singularity out of nothing? Is that an immensely powerful thing? I don't know. I'm not convinced of that, but maybe you can comment.
So I liked Alex's original example that, you could start with something that was not very powerful at all and then bootstrap up to something quite powerful. I mean, this is a different point from the one you're making, I think, but but that doesn't seem impossible. You might think that it's somehow more extravagant because you're postulating more stuff, but it's not obvious to me immediately that that's a worse kind of explanation, right? Rather than just starting with something that's immensely powerful and there's no explanation for it. Right.
Yeah, I think he would say that if you're granting that if on this model there's a sequence of ever more powerful things, but then the thing that's causally immediately antecedent to the universe is immensely powerful, then he's sort of done his job, right? Maybe he would have disputes with you about further aspects of that thing or whether there is this further causal regress. But at the very least, he would think that, yeah, but I've shown that the cause of the universe is something immensely powerful. And I think he would take that as a win, even if it's not a complete win.
So then the other points that you make seem to be points worth making, right? It does depend. So if you're thinking that the role of the being is just to make the initial singularity, depends how we're thinking about the initial singularity, which of course we don't know anything about really, if there is such a thing, but it's kind of hidden behind the screen of inflation. So we don't know whether it's so there were there's a paper that was published in one of Physics Review D or something 20 or 30 years ago, speculating about the possibility of making universes in the lab So you've got some guys in a physics lab, and they produce. What happens is they make a little kind of tear in space-time, and it buds off into a different dimension, and they've created a universe, right? If that kind of speculation had anything to it, you don't need to be particularly powerful to make universes, provided you've already got universes.
Right. Yeah. Depending on what you've got or what you have, it just doesn't seem obvious to me anyway that the thing that could create a universe, even if it turns out to be creating out of nothing, that would have to be immensely powerful. I mean, I don't know. I tend to think of immense power as in part having to do with what's the sort of range and of things that it could do. And if it turns out that the only thing that something could do was make an initial singularity in this way, I mean, maybe that's because of the kind of thing it is. It's not completely lacking of power, or very minimally powerful. But I'm not going to say it's immensely powerful. At least I wouldn't be inclined to say that. But that's my intuition there anyway.
Right. Yeah. Good.
Yeah. Okay. And then another attribute they talk about is the personhood of the cause, which is, of course, critical to Craig's argument, because if you get an impersonal cause, then it's not that helpful as an argument for theism. So let's see what they say about that.
I think, well, to see if I'm getting Craig's argument right again, the idea is something like it's either going to be personal or impersonal. If it's impersonal, then there's some kind of mechanism or something. And the thought would be, well, if the necessary and sufficient conditions to manifest that mechanism's output were present already for eternity or something, then it would have, you can't just say that it just happened to do it 13.8 billion years ago. Why not think that it would have done it a trillion or billion or whatever infinite time ago? We're a bit like the counter down, why he should have finished already kind of thing. But I think then, well, the alternative would be, if it's a person making a free choice, he could have just simply chosen to do it at that point. Like the man who's been sitting in a chair for eternity just decides to stand up at some point. It's sort of explicable in agent causation terms. But I wonder why can't we just describe it in terms of a kind of indeterministic causation? It doesn't have to be the sort of old-fashioned necessary and sufficient conditions analysis of causation. Why not say that there's some it's an indeterministic, like a mousetrap or something that just happened to snap at some point in time, could have snapped at any point, it just happened to snap at that point, and that's the beginning of time. Why does it have to be personal? Personal free choice on a kind of strong libertarian view, possibly stronger view than maybe you take, but looks quite like indeterministic, mechanistic causation anyway. So the two things sort of very similar looking. I'm not sure why I'm compelled to believe in the personal option when the indeterministic causation option looks basically just the same, except without the personal aspect to it, sort of impersonal, indeterministic causation.
Yeah, I don't see any scientifically plausible account of that sort of impersonal, indeterministic causation of the universe. We're talking about a non-physical state of affairs, and therefore I think the appropriate category would be a personal explanation, because appeal to things like quantum indeterminacy and so forth isn't going to get you the origin of the universe just 13.8 billion years ago. If there's any chance of it being metastable and springing into our universe, it will either happen from eternity or not at all. So it seems to me that the inference that we're dealing here with a personal agent is a really persuasive one that advocates of the Kalam argument since Al-Ghazali have argued for.
So let me
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I actually think this is one of the worst parts of the stage too. But I don't know. What do you think about this?
So you mean one of the worst parts on Bill's side, or
On Bill's side, yeah.
So there are plenty of traditions that think of there being something ultimate that's not personal, like the Tao or Brahman or something like that. And it's not clear that it's appropriate to think of those things as mechanisms. So there seems to be a kind of gap that needs filling in Bill's argument there, right? Why the only alternative to a personal God is a physical mechanism, right? So that was first thought. I don't know whether that's what you had in mind. Or...
Yeah, well, that's good. No, I actually had a few different things in mind. One having to do with when Craig talks about okay, so suppose it were a deterministic mechanism, or something that couldn't refrain as a matter of libertarian freedom. He talks about the, a quantum proposal, perhaps, where it would either have obtained from eternity or not at all. Wait a minute. Why would it have obtained from eternity? That seems to imply that there was this eternal history over which it might have obtained. That is to say, are we to imagine that the agential cause has been sitting around for a past eternity and just now decided to do it? That can't be his view, because he denies any sort of temporal regress of that sort. So what is it supposed to be? The point is that if the thing obtains in some sort of timeless state, and regardless whether that it in that state, as a matter of entailment or some other relation, produces a temporal universe, I don't see why we would be inclined to say that it would obtain from eternity, or that what it produces would have an eternal past. I'm frankly, I'm not sure. I'm also not even sure what it even means to talk about the thing being deterministic or indeterministic in this atemporal context. But leaving that aside, I'm just not sure what difference it would make, right? If the condition for the effect to obtain in some way obtains timelessly, and then so it causes some temporal universe, then the question of how long ago that began is just a question of, well, what's the temporal interval from now to the first moment? I don't see what adding on the nature of the cause of that temporal space-time changes to that. Suppose it's deterministic, suppose it's indeterministic. In some sense, I'm not sure why one of them would be worse than the other. And when Craig talks about it having obtained from eternity or not at all, I just, both of those seem like a non sequitur. From eternity seems to presuppose a sort of temporal frame that he would reject anyway, and the not at all seems to be ruling out that the conditions could be sufficient for producing that effect, which again I don't see why that would be. So that's the main concern I have there. And Alex focuses on maybe we could have a sort of non-agential indeterministic cause. Fair enough, and I think it's fair to point out that Craig's response is, again, a sort of lack of imagination. But I don't even think we need to go there. Why suppose that a deterministic cause is any worse?
Yeah.
See what I'm saying?
So another question is somewhere earlier when Craig was talking about non-metrical time, he says that eternity is a point. Or that's what I recall him saying. But in that case, the idea that there's kind of any dimension there just doesn't seem to make any sense at all.
Yeah. Well, so you're pointing out that if there's no sort of measure over this point or whatever it is in this timeless state, then talk about it holding out or something like that doesn't really make a lot of sense.
Yeah, it just doesn't make any sense.
Right. Yeah, the only way it seems to make sense to me is if there is a sort of metric, and in particular this sort of metric that, you have a past eternal history. But why? First of all, why would we require that? And he should deny that based on his other views. So I don't see why that would. And if so, then his view doesn't. This argument for a personal cause here doesn't make sense by his own lights. I don't know. That's what I would want to say about that. It's possible that I'm missing something, but that seems like the right thing to say. I don't know.
Right. So I'm with you. I think that this particular way of trying to argue that the cause is personal is in tension with lots of other things that he says elsewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I'm inclined to side with Alex that, why couldn't there be something that has similar sorts of causal dispositions to this sort of personal cause? In some way, you might specify how it indeterministically produces that effect, but doesn't have the other, or at least some of the other features required for agency. Maybe it's not conscious, or maybe it's not doesn't like deliberate in the way that an agent does, or something like that.
Yeah.
But why would that preclude? Why would there be nothing of that sort? And just pointing out an example that you might think is inadequate is, I think, being too quick or the hasty conclusion based on, well, as Alex put it, a lack of imagination. That's what I would want to say there too. But even before we get to that, I don't think the argument has any, or really much force to it.
So a kind of general point about, I've always thought that where you have these two-stage arguments and you first get down to the conclusion that there's a first cause or, a necessary being or something, and then you try to get from there to the attributes of God, those arguments nearly always turn out to look problematic, I think.
Yeah.
And so, and partly it does feel like it's kind of lack of imagination. So I think that Alex made a good choice in the approach that he took to the question about the attributes of the cause.
Yeah, I mean, we're not really going to talk about much the other attributes that he infers, but even the other ones I don't think are well supported. So like him thinking that the cause would have to be timeless. Well, maybe it would have to be timeless given his other commitments that, that would entail that there has to be some cause that doesn't itself begin to exist. And maybe that would require that it's timeless if there was such a cause. But if we're just thinking about what caused a space-time of this sort, why would that cause itself have to be timeless? In particular, Craig wants to suppose that there's different notions of time. One of them he'll call metaphysical time that might obtain apart from the space-time. He had a recent conversation where he talked about this, and I'm sure he's written and talked about it before, but he said something to the effect of, like, you could imagine that even before he created this universe, he created a sequence of angels or something like that, one after the other. And there'd be a sort of time there, right? But it wouldn't be the time that he created when he created this universe. There wouldn't be this sort of physical time, say. But then why would that... I would want to say, but then you could think that there's something that's temporal in this way that caused a space-time. It doesn't follow that it would have to be timeless. The only way you can, I suppose, on taking the things that he's otherwise said, conclude that it would at least ultimately have to be something timeless would be the causal principle that would seem to rule out something that is a first cause, but not, but begins to exist.
Right. So, I mean, I think there are physical theories where we can think of our time as being internal to our universe, but there's a background space that has lots of universes in it. And the background space also has a time, and on some versions of this, it's past infinite, right? Now, Craig mightn't like that last feature of it, but we could have an origin for the background space. And as far as our time goes, then you've got a background time that you can locate stuff in for the explanation of the coming to be of our universe. Now, Craig could say, well, we've just pushed the kind of overarching problem back a step, but it still turns out that it's not, if we're just thinking about our universe, the hypothesis that there's a background time within which some activity happens hasn't been ruled out, right?
Right. And likewise for some of the other attributes like spatiality and even materiality or physicality. I mean, why not think that? I mean, there's already models where, if you think that there's people who think that our universe is in some way a product of, you can take certain inflationary models, or I think on certain string theoretic models, there's a sort of wider structure to the physical reality beyond just the space-time. You could have things like that, and also it may turn out that what is this? It may turn out, and this also gets back to some of the things that Alex mentioned earlier, which is that it may turn out that there's some of the stuff we want to say about time is sort of not really applicable to some of the broader structure, or doesn't apply in the way that we might intuitively think it would apply. And that's another one of my worries here, is that a lot of these arguments seem to presuppose that our everyday understanding of facts about time and so on are perfectly general, and there's not going to be any sort of indeterminacy or inapplicability of those to certain domains. Now, I'm sure Craig would say something more about this, but I'm not been impressed by some of the things that he has said. But that's a further issue. So, yeah, if there's anything more you want to say about that, or go on to the last point.
Not about this point. There's one more part to the discussion about consciousness, I think.
Yes, that was the last one that I had in my list of timestamps here. So we can play that now.
Just bring up one more grumble, if that's all right. I mean, I know we've
let's have our final grumble.
Which is just there's a kind of weight on the other side of the balance sheet, in my view, which is that if you're going to suppose that there's a personal agent at the beginning of all of this, now we have to suppose that it's possible that there could be a mind that's completely disembodied and changeless.
Yes.
And it's not quite so clear to me that that's unproblematic, right? Like, I think I have this idea that I can tell through my own direct acquaintance with my consciousness, like what it's like to be conscious, that it's dynamic. It's essentially dynamic, it seems to me. That, for instance, if I fall into a completely dreamless sleep and awake from that, from my perspective, I can look at the clock and tell that time has passed, but it doesn't feel like time has passed. It feels like nothing has happened, right? Because my consciousness sort of dropped out because it wasn't changing, because nothing was happening. And I think it seems to me coherent, a thought experiment, that everything freezes, absolutely everything, all motion of everything, and my thoughts themselves freeze. And then it starts again after some period of time. I wouldn't even notice from my point of view, because my conscious experience sort of stops if it's not changing, right? And I think that if that's right, it doesn't make sense to have a changeless personal agent, like a mind that's outside a changing causal order. It just doesn't make sense to me. I think I can tell from introspection that my mind is like a shark. It has to keep moving and changing, or else it just drops out completely.
Well, I would have thought that your illustration showed the exact opposite of that, Alex. That illustration, I think, comes from Sidney Shoemaker's article, Time Without Change, where he imagines that every few years, 1/3 of the universe freezes and becomes utterly immobile and changeless. And he says you wouldn't be aware of it, but you could calculate when it happens. That seems to support the idea of consciousness that is unchanging and frozen into immobility. Now, in my work on God and Time, which is in a sense the sequel to the work on the Kalam cosmological argument, my book God, Time, and Eternity, and the book Time and Eternity, I have chapters where I discuss whether a person can be timeless. Does it make sense to talk about a timeless consciousness? And there I'm persuaded that although this won't be your garden variety person, there is no incoherence in the notion of a timeless person. And your illustration, I think, would actually support that.
Well, gentlemen, I'm sure we could go on for absolutely hours, but we do not.
Okay, so yeah, the final sort of segment here. What do you make of this worry about timeless?
I was really puzzled by the way that this discussion went. So Alex said, consciousness is dynamic, right? And when you're asleep, you're unconscious. You don't have consciousness when you're asleep. I mean, forget about stuff about dreams.
Dreamless sleep, say.
a dreamless sleep. Or suppose you've been knocked unconscious, right? And then there's, so Bill's reply didn't seem to address this point at all. He thought, because what Shoemaker was arguing was that you could have evidence that time had passed even though nothing changed. That's what his thing was supposed to show. But if we imagine that everything's frozen in that very thought experiment, then nobody's going to be conscious of anything during the period of the freeze. So it doesn't help at all to respond to the point that Alex was making. Right? That was
the only way I could imagine that Craig is getting something out of this sort of point is if, well, maybe his thought is that insofar as we exist at all, we must be conscious in some way. So if we could find out that we did exist over this freeze, then our consciousness must have persisted over it too. Right. So the maybe that's what he has in mind, but then he would have to deny that there's you could be unconscious at any point but still exist. And I don't see that as very plausible. At the very least, if you think that your existence, you could exist in a way that you're not conscious, or if there were no activity or no awareness or something, then you wouldn't be conscious. even if in some way a body had persisted over an interval of frozen duration. I don't know. It doesn't seem to be a very plausible response, but maybe you could say more about that.
So also, it won't help if we suppose that dualism is true in your kind of mind and body, because we're imagining that both are frozen, right?
Right. If the immaterial soul is dynamic in some other realm, then okay. But then we're imagining a state where it's entirely unchanging, and
Yeah.
it's not. If it's unchanging in its own right, or if sort of physicalism is true, and it's or we're imagining a state where it's dynamic there, then that's not the scenario. We're supposed to imagine one where there's no change at all, but there's still a sort of consciousness there. Yeah, it doesn't seem very. I want to say maybe there's not a sort of conceptual or a priori impossibility there, but maybe not. But it seems kind of close to that. Like I don't know. If I had to pick a theory, and one theory committed to something like a timeless mind like this, I would take that as a very strong consideration against it. If maybe not an absolute proof, but I'm going to put little weight on that theory so long as there's something else that's comparable, but doesn't otherwise require that commitment. It just seems like a very, very strange commitment, very implausible to me. Even if maybe it's not strictly logically inconsistent, it seems maybe close, if that makes sense. That's how I feel about that generally. I wonder if you feel similar.
Yeah, so I think I do share that view. I wonder whether if you talk to people who meditate, you might be able to get some data that would support Craig. I somehow doubt it. Like even when you achieve a really sort of peak meditative state, I don't think that your consciousness is completely empty. Right.
Yeah.
You don't lose consciousness, right? There's still, you're in a conscious state and there's stuff that's changing.
Right.
It's still a dynamic.
But if you did lose consciousness, then you would lose consciousness, right?
Yeah,
so then you wouldn't be But the other thing to note is that the way that God is often described, it's not really. I mean, you might imagine a sort of deep meditative state where you try to limit as much sort of mental activity as you can. But I don't. People might point out that it's maybe difficult to theorize about what a radically different mind like this would be like. But apart from that, it seems to me like they want to describe God as having at least interesting mental life. He has all sorts of different beliefs. He's perhaps he's has different emotions and like things that he cares about and loves, and has different normative attributes and so on. All these seem to imply a sort of interesting mental life that really seems to stress on or strain the idea that, well, no, it's just all this way in some sort of static sense. I don't know.
Right. So, I mean, of course, there are theists like Thomas who don't think that God's conscious or has a mind at all. Right.
Right.
There are different options here, but for the kind of view that Craig embraces, I think he thinks that God has an active mental life.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Good. We should probably wrap up soon. We're going for almost 2 hours, but I do maybe just some closing remarks. I mean, what do you think about the debate as a whole? And then the stuff
I found the debate interesting. I thought that both people did quite well in the debate. There were a couple of points that a couple of places where I thought that there were kind of better moves to make on either side. But that's inevitably a feature of a debate, I think. And on the whole, I mean, given that my views line up more or less with Alex's, I didn't think that there was anything very troubling to the view that Alex has that emerged on the other side of the debate.
Yeah, fair enough. I'm inclined to agree. Maybe the furthest difference I have with him was on his some of his being more amenable to the meteorological nihilist views, or something near enough. I mean,
Yeah.
it doesn't have to be exactly that, but apart from that, yeah, I thought he did quite well. Craig had some good moments, but yeah, I thought on the whole, and again, maybe this is biased because I don't share many of his views, but I didn't think his approach was that great. But yeah, I think it was quite respectable, and they both presented their side or their positions fairly well, and it was a good discussion. So yeah, again, there's a link in the description where people can watch the original debate if they haven't. But I guess that's it. So yeah, with that, thanks so much for coming on and talking about this and reviewing the debate with me, Graham. And it's been great.
So it was interesting. I know I've never done a review of a debate before. It did make me watch it carefully a couple of times beforehand.
Yeah, but yeah, I thought that'd be cool. I was thinking about just reviewing myself, but I wanted to see if you or someone else wanted to do it. I was thinking about asking Alex, but he'd been quite busy. So, yeah. Oh, I guess I didn't. We didn't cover the moment where he does cite you on something, but
So that was talking about varieties of principles of sufficient reason.
Right.
And,
right. Yeah.
It seems to me that you probably want a principle that allows you to say if there's indeterministic causation, as there might be if there was libertarian freedom, if we had libertarian freedom, that you've got an explanation of what happens when indeterminism plays out a certain way. I mean, there's nothing that explains why you get one thing rather than another, but you've got an explanation in terms of the conditions, the prior conditions that create the range of alternative options. So there's something to say about why we got this thing. We got it because it was one of the things that could have happened given how everything else had been up to that point. And I don't think you want a stronger principle of sufficient reason than that. And I forget exactly what the context was, but Bill Craig was thinking that's all that you need for the kind of principle of sufficient reason that he was interested in invoking at a certain point.
Right. Yeah. We could go back into that, but I think we'll draw it to a close now. I didn't read many of the chats that were going on during the stream, but thanks for the super chats from, let's see, it was from Whale and this guy Drugan. Yeah, Drugan made some points about there being non-standard analyses of infinity where there was half as many even as whole numbers. Yeah, maybe. I don't know. There might be different ways to use these terms where, in some sense, there's quote unquote half as many. I don't know. That's fine. But yeah, we don't need to rehash the earlier parts. But yeah, I'll end the stream there. But thanks so much, Graham, and thanks for everyone for watching. It's been a good one.
Sweet. Yeah. So thanks to everybody for watching, and thanks for inviting me on.